Under the cold white lights of the checkout counter, a young woman with worn-out sneakers placed 3 gold medals on the conveyor belt, hoping the manager might take pity and let her walk out with bread milk and painkillers. The store manager stared at her with open suspicion, while a memorabilia dealer rushed forward, offering to buy everything for almost nothing. As she lowered her head, nearly breaking into tears because she could not cover the bill, a single father from the back of the line stepped forward, blocked the dealer's hand, and asked quietly, "How desperate does a person have to be to sell their entire past?" The morning had started with Naomi Carter counting coins on her kitchen counter, the linoleum cold under her bare feet, her right knee swollen the way it always swelled before rain. $3.42. A half-empty bottle of generic ibuprofen that no longer touched the pain. A refrigerator with 1 egg and a quarter stick of butter. She sat on the edge of the sink for a stretch, looking at the bottom shelf of her closet, where a small velvet pouch had been hidden behind a pair of running shoes she had not been able to wear in nearly 4 years. Inside the pouch were 3 medals, 2 national championships, and 1 from the year she had been called the fastest woman under 25 in the state. Sponsors had lined up after that final race. Magazines had photographed her on the track at sunset. Then, a misstep during a routine training session at the age of 24 had torn 3 ligaments in her left knee, and the surgeons who promised her a full return to competition had left her instead with 2 more operations, a debt she could not pronounce out loud, and a leg that would never run the same distance twice. She put the medals in her tote bag. She put on her oldest sneakers. She walked the 11 blocks to the discount supermarket on Walnut Street because she could no longer afford the bus. She had no real plan for the medals. Some part of her had imagined showing them to the manager, telling him who she had been asking him to hold them as collateral until her next paycheck cleared. The plan sounded foolish in her own head, but desperation had reduced her options to foolish ones. Inside the store, she moved through the aisles, slowly choosing only what she needed: a loaf of bread, a half-gallon of milk, a bottle of store-brand painkillers, a small jar of peanut butter. The total at the checkout counter came to $19.86. She handed the cashier her debit card. The cashier swiped it twice, then a third time, then looked at her with the practiced flatness of someone who had done this many times before. "Cards declined, ma'am." Naomi felt the heat rise up her neck. She reached into her tote bag into the velvet pouch and placed the 3 gold medals on the conveyor belt next to her bread. The cashier blinked. The store manager, who had been hovering near the customer service desk, walked over with the slow, careful steps of someone approaching a problem he did not want. Before the manager could finish his polite refusal, a man in a navy peacoat slid into the space beside her. He had thin gray hair, expensive glasses, and the easy smile of a man who made money off other people's bad days. He picked up one of the medals, weighed it in his palm, and tilted it toward the fluorescent light. $200, Harold Pierce said, addressing Naomi as if the manager were not standing 2 feet away. For all 3. Cash. Right now. The medals were worth on the open market somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000. Naomi knew this because she had checked 3 nights ago on a public library computer with a hand that shook the entire time. She did not say anything. She looked at the bread. She looked at the milk. She looked at the cashier who had begun to ring up the next person in line. That was when the man behind her stepped forward. Caleb Brooks had been holding a gallon of milk and a 6-pack of coffee creamer, the kind his ex-wife used to keep in the refrigerator door before the marriage ended. He was 35, broad through the shoulders, dressed in the kind of clothes a man wears when he has stopped trying to impress anyone. He drove long haul on the interstate 4 days a week and came home to a quiet apartment where he reheated whatever was easiest and went to bed early. He had not planned to involve himself in anything that day, but he had heard the dealer's offer, and he had seen the woman's face, and something in him refused to keep walking. He set his milk and his creamer on the belt. He pulled a worn leather wallet out of his back pocket. He placed his hand gently but firmly between Harold Pierce and the medals. How desperate does a person have to be to sell their entire past? Caleb was not really asking the dealer. He was asking the room. He turned to the cashier. "Ring her groceries up with mine. I'll cover both." The dealer's smile thinned. He started to speak, but Caleb did not look at him. Naomi tried to refuse. She said something about paying him back, something about not needing charity, something that came out broken in the middle. Caleb did not argue. He paid the bill $43.11 in total and gathered the bags himself, including hers. He nodded at the manager. He walked her out of the store and into the gray afternoon light of the parking lot. She stood beside his pickup truck, with her arms wrapped around herself, the velvet pouch back in her tote bag, the 3 medals heavier now than they had ever been on a podium. She told him she could not accept his help. She told him she did not even know him. Caleb set the bags in the bed of the truck. "I know," he said, "but you were going to give that man your medals for $200, and I couldn't watch that happen." There was a diner across the street. He offered her coffee. He told her she did not have to come, and he told her he would not be offended if she walked away. She came anyway, because the alternative was walking 11 blocks home with groceries she had not paid for and a chest full of shame she could not yet name. In the booth by the window, with 2 cups of black coffee between them, the story came out slowly. The injury, the surgeries, the sponsors who had stopped returning her calls within 6 months of her retirement, the medical bills that arrived in envelopes she stopped opening. And then, almost as an afterthought, the contract. There was a company, she said. Her hands were wrapped around the coffee cup as if it were the only warm thing in the room. Athletic Recovery Partners. They reached out a year after my last surgery. They said they specialized in helping retired athletes restructure their finances, manage their remaining sponsorship payouts, apply for medical hardship grants. They sounded official. I signed the paperwork. Caleb watched her without interrupting. She kept going. After that, the deposits I was supposed to receive from my old sponsor, the residuals from the endorsement contracts, the disability insurance from the federation, they all started coming in smaller. Then they stopped coming at all. When I called the company, they sent me explanations I couldn't understand. Fees, processing charges, recovery costs. I asked a friend who works in banking to look at the contract. She told me she couldn't tell what half of it meant. She said it was written to be unreadable on purpose. Caleb thought about this for a moment, looking out the window at the rain that had started against the glass. He had a 14-hour drive scheduled for the next morning. He had responsibilities waiting for him at home. He had nothing in his life that suggested he should pull a thread like this. But the woman across from him had walked into a supermarket with 3 gold medals in her bag, and a man in a peacoat had been waiting for her, like a man who had done it many times before. "What's the company called again?" Caleb asked. "Athletic Recovery Partners." He took out his phone. He typed the name into the search bar. He did not show her what he found. He simply nodded, put the phone face down on the table and said, "Finish your coffee. We'll figure out the next step after." Naomi looked at him across the table. This stranger with calloused hands and tired eyes, who had paid for her bread. And something inside her, something that had been frozen for a very long time, moved a 1/4 inch toward thawing. She did not say thank you. She did not have it in her yet. But she finished her coffee, and when he asked for her address so he could drive her home, she gave it to him. By the time he dropped her off and watched her climb the steps to her building with the grocery bags in her arms, Caleb had already decided. Whatever Athletic Recovery Partners was, he was going to find out. He did not yet know what that decision would cost him. Caleb spent the next 2 evenings at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a laptop, doing the kind of slow, methodical work he usually reserved for logging his miles on the road. Athletic Recovery Partners had a clean website, a stock photo of a smiling man in a wheelchair, and an address that turned out to be a rented suite in a downtown office building. The reviews online were sparse, but disturbing in a quiet way. 3 retired hockey players, one former gymnast, a boxer who had blogged about losing his house. All of them described the same arc: promised help, confusing paperwork, money that disappeared into fees no one could explain. He drove the route between his apartment and the public library 3 times that week, calling Naomi on the way to ask questions she did not always have answers to. The contract she had signed was 28 pages long. Buried on page 19 was a clause that assigned athletic recovery partners a perpetual administrative right over any incoming funds tied to her athletic career. Pension contributions from the Federation, residual endorsement payments, medical hardship disbursements, anything that arrived in her name now passed through their accounts first, and what came back to her, if anything came back at all, was whatever they decided was left after their fees. A friend of Caleb's from his old union days had a brother who worked as a paralegal in Cleveland. Caleb sent him a scanned copy of the contract on a Thursday night. The reply came back on Saturday morning. The contract was in technical terms legal. In every other sense, it was a trap written by someone who knew exactly how to dress predation in compliance language. He started looking for other names. He found a forum for retired track and field athletes where someone had posted a warning about a company that targeted competitors after career-ending injuries. 3 women had replied to that post. 2 of them mentioned Athletic Recovery Partners by name. One of them mentioned a director called Vincent Holloway. Caleb wrote the name down. He underlined it twice. He met Naomi on a Sunday afternoon at the same diner where they had first sat together. She had washed her hair. She was wearing a clean sweatshirt. She still moved, as if she expected the floor to give way beneath her at any moment. He told her what he had found. He told her she was not the only one. He watched her absorb that information the way a person absorbs a second injury on top of an old one, quietly, without surprise, as if some part of her had already known. "There are others?" she asked. "At least 9 that I've identified. Probably more. They go after athletes who blew out a knee, a shoulder, and Achilles. People whose income just stopped. People who don't have a manager anymore because the manager left when the contracts dried up." She studied her hands. "What do we do?" Caleb told her he wanted to meet Vincent Holloway in person. He wanted to look at the man across a table and decide what kind of opponent he was actually facing. Naomi tried to talk him out of it. She told him these were not the kind of people who accepted polite questions. He told her he was aware of that and he was going anyway. The Office of Athletic Recovery Partners occupied the 11th floor of a glass building downtown. The receptionist was friendly. The waiting room smelled like new carpet. Caleb gave a fake reason for his visit. He had told them on the phone that he was a former minor league baseball player, exploring his options after a shoulder reconstruction. They believed him because he looked like a man who had once been an athlete, and because men in his position rarely lied about being broken. He had filled out the intake form with his real name and his real address. He had seen no reason then to lie about either. Vincent Holloway was tall, lean, and dressed in the kind of charcoal suit that costs more than most people's monthly rent. He had a smile that did not reach his eyes, and a handshake that lingered a half-second too long. His office had a view of the river. On the credenza behind his desk sat a framed photograph of him standing beside a former senator at a charity gala, both of them holding champagne flutes. For the first 10 minutes, Vincent ran his pitch. The market was hostile to retired athletes. The federations were stingy. The sponsors had short memories. Athletic Recovery Partners existed to bridge the gap, to make sure men like Caleb did not fall through the cracks. He used the word advocacy 4 times. He used the word family twice. Caleb listened. Then he set a folded piece of paper on the desk. On it was written the name, Naomi Carter, and below it, in his careful block, lettering the dates of her 3 sponsorship payments that had vanished into Vincent's company in the last 14 months. The temperature in the office changed in a way that did not require any words. Vincent picked up the paper. He read it. He set it down. He smiled the same smile he had been smiling for 10 minutes, but now the smile was a wall instead of a welcome. "I see," he said. And what is your relationship to Miss Carter? A friend. A friend. Vincent let the words sit in the air. He leaned back in his chair. Mr. Brooks, I'm going to be very direct with you, because I respect your time. Miss Carter signed a contract. That contract is enforceable in every jurisdiction in this state. If you have been advising her to dispute her obligations, I would strongly suggest you reconsider that advice. We employ excellent counsel. Litigation is expensive, even for the side that wins. Caleb did not move. I'm not interested in litigating anything. Then what is it that you want? I want to know how many of them there are. The athletes, the ones in your filing cabinet. Vincent looked at him for a stretch. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and took out a checkbook. He uncapped a fountain pen with deliberate calm. Mr. Brooks, I'm going to make you an offer that I rarely make. I'm going to write you a check for $40,000. In exchange, you are going to forget Miss Carter's name. You are going to walk out of this building. You are not going to speak to journalists. You are not going to speak to attorneys. And you are not going to speak to anyone who shares my profession. Do we understand each other? That was the moment. Caleb had spent 12 years driving freight across the country. He had carried other people's furniture, other people's machinery, other people's groceries through the snow at 3 in the morning. He had watched the world from the cab of a truck and had decided somewhere along the way that most of what was wrong with it could not be fixed by a man like him. He had accepted that. He had built a small, quiet life on top of that acceptance. But the woman who had laid 3 gold medals on a conveyor belt was not just a woman who had been unlucky. She was a category. She was a pattern. She was one name in a filing cabinet full of names, and the man across the desk was offering $40,000 to keep that cabinet shut. Caleb stood up. He left the check uncapped, the paper untouched. I think I have the answer to my question, he said. Thank you for your time, Mr. Holloway. He walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the cold air, watching the traffic move along the wet pavement. He had come to that meeting still telling himself that this was about helping one person. He left it knowing that was no longer true. He called Naomi from the cab of his truck. He told her what had happened. He told her that whatever this was had stopped being a story about her 3 medals. He told her he was going to need her permission to keep going, because from this point forward, if they pulled on this thread, the people on the other end would pull back. She was quiet on the line for some time. Then she asked him if he had any idea how to find the other athletes. He told her he had a list of names, but he did not yet know how to reach them. She told him that the Federation kept a directory, and that her old coach, a woman named Diane Mercer, who had stayed in touch with her through the worst of her recovery, still had access to it. She would call her. Caleb sat in the truck after they hung up. The rain had started again, soft against the windshield. He did not turn the key for several minutes. He understood now in a way he had not understood before, that he had walked into Vincent's office as one kind of man and walked out as another. The list arrived 2 days later. Diane Mercer had pulled it from an old Federation directory and an alumni network. She still ran out of her home office in Pittsburgh. 11 names, 11 careers ended by injury, 11 contracts signed with athletic recovery partners in the last 5 years. Caleb spread the printout on his kitchen table and worked through the names one by one, calling from the cab of his truck on the long drives, calling from rest stops, calling from the parking lots of warehouses where he waited to load. Most of the calls went to voicemail. The ones that did not went badly. People hung up on him. People told him they had signed non-disclosure agreements. One former cyclist swore at him for 10 minutes before bursting into tears and admitting she had lost her house in March. Naomi worked the list with him from her apartment, her laptop balanced on the same kitchen counter where she had counted coins 3 weeks earlier. She made notes in a spiral notebook in her tight, careful handwriting. She cross-referenced the dates of disappeared payments. She built a timeline. She had not done sustained work of any kind in nearly 4 years, and the act of doing it now made her hands shake at first, then steady. But Vincent Holloway had been preparing for them as well. He had Caleb's name, his address, his employer, every detail Caleb had handed over on the intake form. Before the meeting, in a moment of carelessness, he had not yet learned to regret. A registered letter arrived at Naomi's apartment on a Tuesday. The letterhead belonged to a law firm in the financial district. The letter accused her of breaching the confidentiality clause buried on page 22 of her contract. It demanded immediate cessation of all communications regarding athletic recovery partners. It threatened damages of $75,000. She read the letter 3 times. She set it on the counter. She called Caleb and read it to him over the phone. The same week, Caleb's dispatcher pulled him aside at the freight terminal and asked in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual whether he was involved in some kind of legal dispute. The dispatcher did not say who had called the company. He did not have to. Caleb told him he was not involved in anything that affected his work, and the dispatcher said that was good, because the company had been getting some unusual phone calls about him, and a routine driver review was coming up at the end of the month. That night, Caleb sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall. The job at the freight company was the steadiest thing in his life. It was the reason he could afford his apartment, his health insurance, the small savings account he had been rebuilding since the divorce. If he lost it, he did not know what he would do next. He thought about the $40,000 Vincent had offered him. He thought about how clean and simple that money would have been. Then he thought about Naomi at the diner, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, telling him she did not even know how to read what she had signed. Harold Pierce had not disappeared either. He had been calling Naomi twice a week since the day at the supermarket, leaving messages in a soft, almost paternal voice, raising his offer each time. $2,000, $5,000, $8,000. He never mentioned the supermarket directly. He spoke as if he were a concerned collector who had simply heard through channels that she was in difficulty. He left his number. He hinted that there was a buyer in Europe who valued provenance. He told her in the last message that the metals would mean more in a private collection than they would gathering dust on her shelf. She stopped answering. She stopped checking the messages. She put the velvet pouch back behind the running shoes in her closet and tried not to think about it. The break came on a Friday evening. Naomi came home from a shift at the community recreation center, where she had picked up part-time work, checking IDs at the front desk. The deadbolt on her apartment door was scratched. The doorframe was splintered. Inside, the place had been searched without much care for hiding the search. Drawers stood open. Cushions had been pulled off the couch. The closet door hung at an angle. The velvet pouch was gone. She sat down on the floor of her bedroom in front of the open closet, and her chest went hollow. She had spent 4 years losing things: her career, her body, her name in the small world that had once known it. She had told herself all that time that the medals were the part she could keep, the part nobody could take from her, the proof that the years before the injury had actually happened. She called Caleb. She did not cry on the phone. She told him in a flat, exhausted voice what she had come home to. He drove across town and arrived inside of 20 minutes. He walked through the apartment slowly. He looked at the door. He looked at the open drawers. He looked at the way the closet had been searched. Whoever had done this had known where to look. They had not torn the apartment apart. They had gone to the closet first. "Harold knew where I kept them," Naomi said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I told him, the day at the supermarket. He asked, and I told him before I knew what he was." Caleb did not answer right away. He was thinking about the way Harold Pierce had appeared at the checkout counter the moment Naomi's card was declined, as if he had been called in by phone. He was thinking about the way Vincent had spoken about athletic recovery partners, some filing cabinet of names. Vincent had the names. Harold had the buyers. Somewhere between them was a list of women like Naomi, and a network that flagged each of them the moment her card stopped working at a register. He drove that night to the address he had pulled from the records of Pierce's antiques business. It was a storage facility on the south side of the city, a long row of orange roll-up doors lit by flickering security lights. Unit 47. He had to wait until almost 2 in the morning sitting in his truck across the street before a black sedan pulled up and Harold got out. Harold went into the unit. He came out 20 minutes later carrying a small velvet pouch. Caleb had brought a phone with a working camera and the number of a reporter at the city's daily paper, a woman named Janet Reeves. He had called her 3 days earlier, the morning after the lawyer's letter arrived at Naomi's apartment, because he had decided that if Vincent's people were already moving, he could not afford to keep this story to himself any longer. Janet had written a piece 3 years earlier about a different financial scam targeting retirees, and she had listened to Caleb on the phone for almost an hour without interrupting once. She had told him she would consider it, but she would need more than his word. The photographs he sent her that night from across the street of the storage facility were enough to change her mind. 2 days later, Janet met Caleb and Naomi at a coffee shop near her newsroom, away from the diner that had begun to feel like a place under watch. She brought a recorder and a notebook. She listened for almost 3 hours. She asked careful questions. At the end, she told them she would need at least 2 weeks to verify what they had given her, and she would need Naomi to be willing to have her name in the article. Naomi said yes without lifting her eyes from the table. When the article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, it ran under a photograph of the storage unit's open door, and inside that door, on a long folding table, were lined up dozens of trophies, framed jerseys, championship rings, and medals kept like inventory in a stockroom, each one tagged with a name. The article named Athletic Recovery Partners. It named Vincent Holloway. It named Harold Pierce. It named 7 of the 11 athletes on Diane's list, and it quoted Naomi at length. The story was picked up within 48 hours by the wire services. A national morning show called Naomi's Apartment. She agreed to appear. She sat under the studio lights in a borrowed blouse, her hands folded in her lap, and she told the host in plain language about the day she had walked into the supermarket and laid 3 gold medals on the conveyor belt because she could not pay for bread. The host asked her what she wanted people to take away from the story. Naomi looked into the camera before she answered. "I want them to know that the people who win for this country are the same people we forget the moment they get hurt," she said. "I want them to know that there are companies built specifically to find us in those moments. And I want the next 24-year-old who tears her knee apart to know that she is not alone, and she does not have to sign anything she does not understand." The federal investigation opened the following week. Agents from the FBI's white-collar unit arrived at the offices of Athletic Recovery Partners with a warrant and left with 31 boxes of documents. Vincent Holloway was arrested at his home on a Wednesday morning. Harold Pierce was arrested the same afternoon at his shop on Aldrich Avenue. The storage unit was unsealed by federal agents, and the contents cataloged. All 3 of Naomi's medals, the ones Harold had taken from her closet that Friday evening, were among the items recovered still in the velvet pouch he had bought them in, but never paid her for. The settlement process took almost a year. Naomi recovered most of the money that had been siphoned from her over the previous 14 months. 7 of the other athletes received full restitution. 2 of them, the ones who had lost their homes, received additional damages from the civil class action that Janet's reporting had helped to seed. Caleb kept his job at the freight company. The driver review came and went without incident. His dispatcher never mentioned the unusual phone calls again, and Caleb did not ask. In the spring, Naomi took a position as an assistant coach at a community track program in a neighborhood across town from where she had grown up. The program ran on a small budget and served young runners whose families could not afford private clubs. She did not run with them. Her knee would never allow that again. But she stood at the curve of the track in the early evening stopwatch in her hand, and she told them where to put their feet. The 3 medals she had once tried to trade for bread were mounted on the wall of the small office at the back of the rec center. She had thought for a long while that she would put them away in a box and never look at them again. In the end, she had decided that they weren't symbols of who she had been before her injury. They were proof that she had survived everything that had come after. Caleb came by the rec center sometimes on the days he was home from the road. He sat on the bleachers and watched her work. She would walk over between drills the stopwatch around her neck, and they would talk for a few minutes about ordinary things. The weather, the traffic, what she was going to make for dinner. On one of those evenings, late in the summer, with the sun going down behind the chain-link fence at the far end of the track, she said something she had been meaning to say for a long while. "You didn't have to do any of it. You didn't even know me." Caleb watched the runners moving through the curve, their shadows long against the rust-colored surface of the track. "Success will let the whole world know your name," he said. "But it's failure that shows you who actually stays. A decent country shouldn't only cheer for people when they're winning. It should know how to protect them when they fall." She did not answer. She did not need to. She walked back to the curve of the track, raised the stopwatch, and called the next runner to the line.